So, hello, greetings from Berlin. I am Jürgen Kocka, historian from the Free University of Berlin and from the Social Science Center Berlin. And my topic today is German unification and the political order 30 years later. The years 1989 to 90 are usually seen as a basic turn in German history, a turn to the better. The protests by East German citizens, which helped to bring down the East German dictatorship, are nowadays usually remembered as the peaceful revolution, mostly with approval, respect, even admiration. The unification of the two German states, which largely took place according to the West German model, is discussed in more differentiated forms. Not everybody likes the way it was done, but hardly anybody argues that we would be better off now if Germany were still divided. Usually the story of the peaceful revolution and of German unification or reunification is told in national historical terms as a central part of German modern history. But today I want to emphasize the international and transnational dimensions of how they interacted with domestic developments. I will do this in 3 steps. First, I shall speak about developments up to the end of 1989 under the heading Exit from Communism. Secondly, I will consider the year 1990, in which the new political order was negotiated within Germany as well as internationally. Finally, I will look on some consequences of those remarkable decisions and events in the long run. When we tell the story of the East German peaceful revolution of 1989, we should start with glances to Moscow, Warsaw, and Budapest. In the Soviet Union, Gorbachev had been elected General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985. He had started with deep-reaching political reforms, aiming at making the economy more productive, the public space more lively, and politics a bit less hierarchical. In 1988 and in the first part of 1989, Polish and Hungarian reformers had managed to insert liberal and democratic elements into an until then rather hierarchical, authoritarian political system, including the introduction of relatively free elections and including the gain of some national autonomy without revolution and without leaving the Soviet bloc altogether. It had become clear that, in contrast to previous decades, the Soviet government would not anymore intervene, at least not with military force, to protect the East European regimes against internal challenges and their communist structures against moderate steps of liberalization. The GDR was peculiar in that it was one of 2 states with one and the same nationality, the other German state in the West being much larger and more successful. It was a permanent frame of reference and self-comparison for envious East Germans, a big brother and rival which had never fully accepted the division of the land. That means never fully accepted the existence of the German Democratic Republic, GDR. For instance, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, the West, offered full citizenship status to all Germans who came, including those from the GDR, whenever they made it across the fortified borders, a standing invitation to come. In the fall of 1989, after years of economic decline, failed reforms, and growing popular dissatisfaction, East Germans, well informed by West German TV, knew what had happened in Moscow, in Hungary, in Poland. They understood that the Soviet grip was loosening, and they reacted with an interplay of exit and voice, to quote the famous title by Albert Hirschman, which brought the communist regime under Erich Honecker down in less than 3 months. First, a mass migration to the West set in, particularly after the Hungarian government opened its borders on September 11th. Through this crack in the Iron Curtain, masses of East German refugees moved to Austria and from there to the Federal Republic of Germany, 25,000 just in the first night after the Hungarian-Austrian border had become permeable. This well-publicized mass exodus challenged the legitimacy of the East German regime even further and weakened it economically. Some of the many who stayed started to make themselves heard. Small groups of dissidents had been in existence for a while. Now they became more visible. Intellectuals, artists, church people, peace activists, and others. New reform groups were formed by persons who learned to be politically active for the first time in their lives. They could cooperate to some limited extent with a few reformers within the party of power. Gorbachev's visit to the GDR in early October accelerated a sequence of non-violent demonstrations which demanded reforms, demanded the freedom to travel, more consumer goods, socialism with the human face, as it was called, democratization. They did not ask for national unity, nor, of course, for capitalism. The first demonstrations were small and cautious, fearful in the beginning. They were repressed, but not totally. They were supported by prayers and much civil courage, quickly growing to the level of several hundred thousands each in late October and early November, particularly in the city of Leipzig and later on in Berlin. The regime considered violent reaction. Tanks, prisons, and hospitals were well prepared in early October. Everybody knew what had happened on Tiananmen Square in Beijing in June 1989. But nearly a miracle as perceived at that time, police violence remained very limited. The army was not called into action. Under the combined pressure of mass exodus and mass demonstrations, faced by an imminent economic disaster, without further encouragement by the Soviet protector, the self-confidence of the East German rulers quickly eroded. They were irritated by what was happening in Gorbachev's Soviet Union, in Poland and Budapest. The party fragmented, leaders retired or had to step down. The system became slightly chaotic. In the evening of the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall, separating East from West Berlin rather hermetically, was opened by the East German authorities, partly due to a mistake of communication within the confused nomenclatura, but irreversible without coercion and violence, which the rulers were not ready to risk. Hundreds of thousands of East Berliners flooded West Berlin, met relatives and friends there, had a close look on the temples of consumerism, which they had so long admired only from distance. They maybe danced in the streets or even on the wall, celebrated and went home. These were days of great public emotions. These were decisive steps towards bringing the communist government down, while it was still completely unclear to which alternative structure this would lead. A bit later, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria managed and experienced their exits from communism, comparable but in different forms. Clearly, the East German peaceful revolution was an integrated part of a broader East European development. What did these different cases have in common? What defined exit from communism in East Central Europe? Very shortly, 5 points. First, these cases strongly influenced one another. It was like in a domino game. Once communist leaders started falling in one place, their legitimacy elsewhere was severely reduced. Here lies the outstanding importance of Poland and Hungary, who were first. They served as examples. They were contagious. Second, everywhere change was systemic. That is, it was simultaneous change of the political system, of the economic order, of social processes, and of the dominant ideologies. Away from communism towards more liberal, democratic, more constitutional forms of government, towards market economies and more open societies, less controlled, with more freedom. It is this systemic character, plus their sheer speed, which perhaps justifies to call those changes revolutionary, particularly in Germany and Czechoslovakia. Third, the crowds and the activists of 1989 detested, rejected violence, and largely managed to stay non-violent, with the exception of Romania. Their pacifist quality was remarkable, tactically shrewd, and based on conviction, understandable on the background of the excesses of violence earlier in the 20th century, which served as an experience to be avoided at any rate. It's equally remarkable that the regimes collapsed and the governing elites stepped down without using violent means, without using police and armies to a larger extent. Coercive means were available but remained largely unused. Most European communist dictatorships in the late 20th century broke down without war and violence. They collapsed, they imploded. They had not to be battled down in bloody wars. Fourth characteristic of this exit from communism in Eastern Europe in the late 20th century, the quest for national identity and national autonomy was strong and served as a factor of change, directed against the supranational Soviet Empire. The turn of 1989 reconfirmed, restored, and re-established the principle of the nation state in this part of the world. On the other hand, The language used for justifying change pointed frequently towards levels beyond the nation and beyond the nation state. Europe and returning to Europe were positive code words, and European values were quoted, including individual rights, civic obligations, the freedom of expression and movement. Europe could be associated with a market economy, with civil society, or just with a normal, modern, desirable way of life. The opposite to communism of the past decades was not capitalism, but Europe. Finally, the fast and systemic changes in those East Central European countries had similar causes. Nearly everywhere, economic decline took place in the 1980s and led to growing popular dissatisfaction. The media allowed self-comparison with the West, particularly in East Germany. There was still much Cold War between East and West in the 70s and 80s, but some steps towards détente were successful. Just think of the Helsinki Conference of 1975. And this made it increasingly difficult for the communist regimes to depict their capitalist neighbor countries as threatening enemies. But this strategy, seeing the neighbors as enemies, had been a source of system legitimization in previous years. Also, generational change played a role. But the most important causes behind the deep changes of 1989 were related to Gorbachev. Not that he urged the leaders and activists between Berlin and Sofia to go ahead with reforms. But on the one hand, his policies of reform, perestroika and glasnost, served as a model, not for the leaders, yet for oppositional groups in the satellite countries. On the other hand, it became increasingly clear that under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union had to reduce its economic subsidies to its satellites, for instance, the supply of oil below world market prices, because the Soviet Union could not afford this kind of generosity anymore, being economically weak and needy herself. And perhaps most important, it became clear that under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union would not anymore intervene, at least not with military force, to protect its satellite regimes against internal opposition, even if challenged, even if communist principles were challenged. So without Soviet protection and backing, the Central and East European regimes were deprived of their most forceful instrument for defending themselves against growing opposition. With this risky reform policies, Gorbachev tried to fight and reverse the deep crisis into which the Soviet Union had fallen under his predecessors. The Soviet Union had just suffered a humiliating defeat, military defeat in Afghanistan. She faced an expensive armament competition with the United States, now under President Ronald Reagan. The Soviet economy was suffering, indebted, inferior in many ways. A centrally administered, non-market economic order had been good enough in previous decades for building railroads, exploiting coal mines, and running steel mills in an earlier phase of industrialization. But it turned out that this system was not good enough in the period of the electronic revolution, in the period of IT innovations, and network societies. By the 1980s, political and economic decline endangered the communist system. With the help of reforms and by letting the periphery go, Gorbachev hoped to preserve the system's core elements and its principles. This was, as we know, a miscalculation, but it reflected very real constraints and had world historical consequences. So much with respect to the revolutionary part of my story, which has taken place in East Central Europe in 1988-89, without much direct influence from the West. Now I move to the second chapter. As a consequence of the breakdown of communism, the political order had to be renegotiated, both inside Germany and in Europe at large. And this largely took place in 1990. Let me look on the German scene first. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the topic of unification moved to the foreground, and West Germans became major actors. In the demonstrations in East German cities, the quest for joining the West with its superior living standard became more frequent, more urgent, and soon the majority mood. Quite in contrast to the preferences of the intellectual leaders and political activists who had led the opposition so far and who continued to demand the thorough democratization of the GDR, but at the same time, the continuance of the GDR as a separate socialist state, autonomous and different from capitalist bourgeois West Germany, which most of these persons did not like. But this became a minority position. The majority increasingly favored unification, merger with the West. East Germans could travel now. Their exodus to the West became even more massive and an existential threat to the East German economy. Anyway, the East German economy was in the process of decline, of faltering. The GDR was bankrupt. Her government applied for help from the West German brother or sister state after the Soviets had indicated that they could not and would not grant economic and financial help anymore. West German media, parties, politicians, groups, citizens were not anonymous at all with respect to reunification, but the majority of them tended to underwrite the goal of unification to different degrees of enthusiasm. Free elections were held in the still existing GDR in March 1990 for the first time after more than 40 years. In this election, a majority of East Germans made it clear that they preferred merger with West Germany as quickly as possible at West German terms. This meant a tremendous boost of recognition. In a way, it meant victory for the West German Federal Republic. The West Germans disposed of a highly successful capitalist economy, a functioning parliamentary democracy, a relatively lively civil society, and much support in the international field. In other words, East German shortcomings strongly contrasted with West German success. This is at least how many contemporaries in the East and in the West then perceived the situation in 1989. and they were not altogether wrong. Against this background, it is perhaps understandable that the process of unification to come would turn out to be extremely asymmetric, in the sense that it would take place under West German leadership and be shaped according to West German principles, instead of being negotiated between two partners of equal standing. There was also much common ground left between Germans on both sides of the border. Over the 40 years of division, cross-border family relations and other contacts had survived. East Germans knew a lot about life in West Germany, since most of them watched West German TV regularly. Both German states had observed each other, competed with each other, developed some cooperation in the midst of tensions. And the common nationality, being German, speaking the same language, having a long common history up to 1945, was a shared cultural basis to which enough Germans on both sides felt sufficiently committed. On this basis, unification, when it became possible, appeared to be a natural thing to do, or at least to accept. There was much uncertainty, there was public debate and controversy in the first months of 1990. It was not only necessary to find some kind of arrangement between East Germans and West Germans. It was even more important to find a solution which would not be blocked by the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. That means not blocked by the states who, as a consequence of German defeat in 1945, still held basic powers over both German states in 1989-90. So domestic decisions had to be squared with diplomatic negotiations, and most neighbors of Germany were not at all enthusiastic about the perspective of a reunified, stronger and sovereign German state. Both in the West and in the East, both inside and outside Germany, there were those who wanted to keep both German states in existence, at least for a while. This strategy failed because of the tremendous pressure coming out of the East German mass movements, the failing East German state, and because of a determined West German policy under Chancellor Helmut Kohl. On both sides there were voices who advocated unification but wanted to achieve it by first terminating the existence both of the GDR and of the FRG, of East and of West Germany, in order then to create something new, a newly united Germany on the basis of a newly framed constitution and of a popular referendum. This strategy, which would have needed much time and could have led to unpredictable results, did not find majority support either. Rather, an asymmetric and speedy form of unification was chosen. There were, it's true, negotiations between representatives from both sides who framed treaties which were ratified by the elected parliaments of both states. But in essence, unification was designed as an extension of the West German Federal Republic to the east, and as the accession of the East German GDR to the expanding West German Federal Republic. In the summer of 1990, already in the summer, the Economic and Social Union was concluded. One market, one currency, namely the German D-Mark, one system of social protection. In the fall of 1990, the constitutional and political union followed: one constitution, one legal system, one welfare state, essentially the West German parliamentary democracy enlarged. For the West Germans, the name, the flag, the national anthem stayed the same, while nearly everything changed for the East Germans. So there was much continuity between the old Federal Republic of Germany, one of two German states, and the new Federal Republic of Germany, enlarged, extended to the east, absorbing the GDR, which ceased to exist. All this depended on the acceptance of German unification by the major powers in the international arena. And this acceptance was achieved in a complicated diplomatic process between November 1988 and September 1990. What were the main issues? Which were the main controversies? Resistance against German unification played an important role in the beginning. But already in late January 1990, Gorbachev realized that the Soviet Union was not anymore strong enough to keep under control the failing, changing, and help-demanding East German state. He stated that it was now up to the Germans themselves to decide this issue of unification or separation. The leaders of some Western powers, especially of Britain, France, and Italy, had quietly counted on Gorbachev's stiff resistance against German unification, which they did not like either. Now they had to follow suit. They realized that they could not prevent this dynamic process, which was already on the way and received so much support by the East German People's Movement, by West German and East German diplomacy, as well as by the Washington government, which was a steady supporter of German unification. The Poles and other East Central Europeans were ready to accept German unification as soon as the Germans would finally accept the geography and the legitimacy of her eastern borders, which had emerged from World War II, and which the West German government had so far avoided to fully recognize. This recognition took place now. Finally, German unification was accepted by all neighbors. And when reading the sources, one gets the impression that many of the main actors were quietly convinced that the division of a nation like the German one was something artificial, which should and would not endure forever. The dominant categories of political thought were deeply impregnated by convictions about the historical legitimacy of nations and nation-states. How would German unification impact on the future of European integration? Would Germany, enlarged, more powerful, and perhaps more ambitious, disrupt the balance which had made the European community possible? This was another issue on the agenda. It could be solved by satisfying the French, who were worried about the superiority of the German economy and the German currency. Paris demanded to go ahead with establishing the European Monetary Union and creating a common European currency which would replace the national currencies. In previous years, the German government had supported this plan as a major step towards deepening European integration. But according to the Germans, this should take place after achieving more convergence among the partner states in economic and financial policy respects. Now the Germans gave in and accepted to go ahead with founding a common European currency now, right away. The British government did not like this move. Mrs. Thatcher stayed skeptical in this and in other respects. But for most European governments, German unification became more acceptable since the increasing size and power of Germans would be balanced by their even closer integration into the institutional framework of the European community. So, European integration made German unification easier, perhaps even possible, while German unification gave an additional push to the advancement of European integration. The most controversial question related to the European security architecture of the future. On the one hand, there were those who held that the Cold War between East and West had come to an end, and that as a consequence, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, had become less necessary and a bit anachronistic. They demanded new treaties, a new pan-European security structure, which would include the Soviet Union and preferably cover the whole area from the Atlantic in the west to Vladivostok in the east. This idea remained vague. Its supporters differed in many details, but it would have been a bold new departure. Gorbachev favored this perspective. He saw it as a way to facilitate the necessary reforms within the Soviet Union and make the Soviet Union more European. The French Minister-President François Mitterrand had sympathy for thoughts like that, and within Germany, the Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, flirted with similar ideas for a while. On the other hand, there were those who strongly advocated the continuous centrality of a strong NATO as a mechanism for granting stability to the region and for securing peace in the future. They even demanded that united Germany would have the right to belong to NATO if she decided so. This was the policy of the American government under President George Bush, soon fully supported by the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. There were others who found this solution attractive because it would integrate and, in a way, control Germany most effectively in military and strategic terms. The second, the American option, prevailed. NATO continued to exist, certainly also as an instrument for maintaining and securing American influence in post-Cold War Europe. It was a solution which emphasized continuity, not really a new departure. It carried the stamp of the conservative realism of George Bush and his administration. Grudgingly, Gorbachev accepted even the NATO membership of unified Germany, to the surprise of many. The Soviets did not even receive a clear assurance that NATO would not extend its reach to the east. All this shows how weak Gorbachev and his companions were in these decisive months. Opposed at home, alarmed by the beginning disintegration of the empire, under severe pressure by the economic crisis of the Soviet Union and its imminent bankruptcy. The Soviet government needed financial help badly. It was certainly of great importance that the German Chancellor in these decisive months could offer to Gorbachev considerable sums in hard German currency. Wealthy West Germany paid an amount equal to 40 to 70 billion euros in present prices. And had Gorbachev demanded more, he could have gotten more. Looking back on these settlements 30 years later, it is amazing to see how conservative they were in essence. Both inside Germany and on the European level, experiments and new departures were discussed but rejected. The new Germany was an enlarged version of the old Federal Republic. The security architecture of Europe after 1990 resembled the one before 1989 in basic respects. The United States of America then were still committed to Europe and powerful before and after 1989-90. There was much continuity in all those ruptures and breaks. Of course, there were losers. Inside Germany, many inhabitants of the GDR, soon of the former GDR of the East, experienced hardship, unemployment, enforced changes of their life, which, again, they could not control. They experienced a new form of dependence now on the West. This has become a major criticism of the way we operated the process of unification 30 years ago. It was a deeply asymmetric affair, decided and engineered by the West, with the Easterners as recipients, objects, and in a way, second-class citizens. I think this was, to some extent, unavoidable, but it created a new dimension of inequality, which is, in retrospect, much deplored and not without justification. On the international level, the Soviet Union was the big loser, and it would dissolve soon. Gorbachev's bold reform strategy largely failed within the Soviet Union, but it opened the window of opportunity, a short window of opportunity, for German unification. I see Gorbachev as a tragic figure. The new political order of the continent did not really accommodate the interests and needs of the Soviet Union, soon of Russia. It turned out, this political order of the continent turned out to be too much centered on the West. It took only 10 to 15 years that the re-strengthened Russia under Putin would question this order, resent the expansion of NATO and the European Union towards the East, and turn in some ways against the West again. Something we have now, and something which other strategic solutions in the year 1990 could perhaps have avoided. But there were many winners and tremendous gains as well. The political order of Germany as framed in 1990 offered to its new citizens coming in from the East tremendous gains as to freedom, life chances, and living standard compared to what they had had in the GDR previously. The political order of 1990 has turned out to be a good framework for the long and protracted process of economic, social, and cultural unification between the two parts of Germany, which is still not perfect and not yet finished. The political order of 1990 has proven its worth as a framework for peaceful change and democratic conflict solution. Compared with the dark history of Germany in the first half of the 20th century, the Federal Republic so far has been a success story, though not without problems, deficits, and challenges. And this positive evaluation holds with respect both to the old Federal Republic before and the enlarged Federal Republic after unification. Looking back on these settlements 30 years later, it is worthwhile noting that they were successful in avoiding worse alternatives. Many of us have feared that such basic changes like those of 1989-90 would not take place without violence, without war and human losses. But these were largely avoided. Many of us also feared that an enlarged, unified, and strengthened Germany would become a destabilizing troublemaker on the European scene, a new center of nationalism, a new and perhaps aggressive agent of power politics. This was avoided too. The changes of 1989-90 implied a renewed recognition of the strength of the nation state. The settlements we discussed today recognized this new evaluation of nation and nation state. At the same time, the political order as framed in 1990 opened up new opportunities for the further integration of Europe, which indeed occurred in the following years. German unification and European integration became not only compatible, but also mutually reinforcing each other. For the East, Central, and Eastern European states winning back their national sovereignty, Europe became an attractive perspective to which they could turn and did turn in the following years, not without creating new problems for European integration, as we know in the meantime. So the actors of 1989-90 were sufficiently skillful and prudent to prevent catastrophic developments. If one knows about the catastrophes in other parts of the world and in Europe in earlier parts of the 20th century, this is something to be mentioned with recognition and respect. Thank you for your attention.